All right, everyone. So, part two of our lecture for today. Today, we're going to look at the civil rights movements for other groups in the United States during the roughly the same time period, the 1960s and 70s as well. Okay. Now, while the civil rights movement is traditionally just kind of focuses on Dr. King, Malcolm X, African Americans, the 60s were a time for change, widespread change. Like I mentioned in the last video, things were a little bit more malleable during this time period. People were more open to change, right? And so therefore, there was this desire and this push to actually try to change things in order to make life a little bit more equitable for people in the 1960s and 70s. And like I said, it wasn't limited to African Americans. There are many other groups in American society that were not given equal opportunities and equal treatment. So let's go ahead and talk about a few of those groups today just to kind of bring the civil rights movement to a full circle. So we'll talk about American Latinos in the next small portion here. So Latinos is a large group, right? There's different people, and throughout the history of the United States, there are different waves of Latinos moving to the United States. The biggest group has always been Mexicans, mostly because of our proximity. But during the Mexican-American War in 1848, when we took over California, Nevada, Arizona, right, all those states already had a lot of people of Latin descent, which eventually became part of the United States when those territories were switched over. In the 1910s, there was a revolution in Mexico. Many people fled to the U.S. to escape the violence of the revolution or the poverty that came before the revolution. And then in the 1940s and 50s, we had the Bracero program, which we talked about in our World War II unit, in which many people were given the opportunity to come to the U.S. legally in order to work on American farms during the war. From Cuba, Cubans going mostly into Florida and the East Coast. Cuba, we had a lot of people fleeing Cuba in the 1960s from Fidel Castro's communist regime and coming to the U.S. And then throughout the history of Cuba's communist regime up till today, really, essentially, there have been many people still fleeing Cuba and coming to the U.S. for a better life. Puerto Ricans, Puerto Rico became part of the U.S. during the Spanish-American War, and so people who live in Puerto Rico can travel to the U.S. and immigrate to the U.S. freely. But in the 60s especially, as the threat of Cuba and Fidel Castro and whatever else was going on there increased, many people also came to the U.S. to look for safety and better opportunities. And then there are various Latin American revolutions in the 1960s in various Central and South American countries, which also led to widespread immigration in the U.S. from those various countries. So the Latino population in the U.S. is extremely diverse, people from different countries in Latin America, and there have been different waves throughout our history. Now, problems that exist for Latino immigrants in general. Poverty and unemployment being the top two. In many parts of the country, just like with African Americans, Latinos were not given the same economic opportunities that others were. Oftentimes, they were limited to lower wage jobs, hourly wage jobs, and not career jobs. Also, many people were forced into segregated neighborhoods called barrios. This is especially true in places like in Los Angeles and other parts of the West Coast. People faced prejudice and discrimination. And in the 60s, as there was kind of a big wave, as we saw in this chart, right, the 60s were a time period of increased immigration from across the board for Latinos, there was a push for equal rights and for more power. And that led to various movements. Two important figures to note here are Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. Okay, they both helped fight for the farm workers, most of which were of Latino origin, especially in California. Many of the people working in the crops and the fields of California were Latino, especially in the Central Valley. So think about places like, places near Bakersfield, Salinas, places that aren't too far from where we live. Okay, and these workers essentially had no representation. Even those who were here legally, which was a large population, either having limited English skills or living in poverty or just being afraid of losing their jobs, right, didn't have the ability to kind of stand up and push for better working conditions. And in fact, many people were forced to work in really, really horrendous conditions. Long hours, low pay. Oftentimes they were given, unfair contracts, which would essentially give them less than minimum wage. Or they would be forced to, work in the fields in the hot sun all day without water, without access to a restroom. Stuff like that, right? So in 1962, the National Farm Workers Association was created by Chavez and Huerta, eventually leading to a union called the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee in 1966. And they organized things like the grape boycott in California, in which grape workers refused to work. Many refused to work, and then they also pushed for people to not buy grapes in order to kind of put pressure on the growers, the grape growers, to give better working conditions in order to improve the lives of those working in the fields, those growing food for everyone in America, right? And Chavez borrowed a lot of his strategies and techniques from other civil rights leaders like Dr. King, right? All peaceful protest, a lot of marches. He would go on personal like hunger strikes and stuff like that. And he was a very, very popular leader. Now, unfortunately, he was not assassinated, but one of his biggest allies was the Kennedy brother, right, Bobby Kennedy. Kennedy was unfortunately assassinated in Los Angeles in 68. And had Kennedy won the election in 68, which was very likely, I think, or at least there was a good chance of him defeating Nixon, I think more could have been done for the farm workers and for Latinos in the U.S. But unfortunately, he was assassinated, and that did kind of put a damper on their chances. However, they were able to push for some better treatment in the farms, although nowadays there still is a lot of issues with that, especially for workers who are here undocumented, because they're not going to go to the authorities and say, hey, my boss is not paying me, because they're working under fear of deportation or even just fear of losing a job, which they need. All right. But again, important step here. In other fields, there are also movements for Latino Americans to gain more power. The Brown Power movement, which kind of went along with the Black Power movement, pushed for more educational opportunities for Latinos in the United States. It led to the Bilingual Education Act of 1968, which guaranteed the opportunity to bilingual education in many states. That has since been reduced, but it was something which at the time was seen as a very positive step forward. The Chicano movement led to these East LA school walkouts in 1968. People just walked out of school in order to kind of show and protest that they were not being given equal opportunities. And then in the 60s, we started to see more Hispanic representation in the government. Joseph Montoya being one of the most famous elected officials during this time period. And then various political parties like La Raza Unida coming together and pushing for local government change and actually having some pretty significant change at the local level. They didn't really have a ton of change at the state or national level, as most of these third parties tend to not do. But from a local point of view, especially in these primarily Latino communities, these various groups were able to push for some meaningful change. Okay, and then let's look at women as well, in terms of the women's rights movement. Now, in post-war society, women were expected to fit certain roles. They were expected to be the housewife, they were expected to take care of the children, clean the house, take care of the husband, do everything at home, right? And this kind of went along with the rise of the suburban life in the 1950s, right? As we started to move away from the cities, people started to move into the suburbs and the kind of cookie-cutter neighborhoods. The woman was expected to be the one who stayed at home and took care of the new kind of homestead, the house, right? However, women were not really given the same political and economic opportunities as men, right? Now, while there were small pushes in past times, so right in the 19-teens at the end of, or during World War I, in the 1930s and 40s, World War II, women were kind of pushed into the workforce, given opportunities, given a chance to be individuals. But then when the 50s came back, they were kind of pushed back into that expectation of you have to be the housewife. Well, in the 60s, as there was this kind of desire for change and push for change, and the fact that many of the people pushing for, Black rights and Latino rights were women, there was some crossover between those two movements, or those various movements, which then gave rise to the feminist movement and women pushing for their own change and their own equality. Okay. Like I said, they're involved in the various movements like the SNCC and the SCLC, right? Movements for African American equality. And then those who had leadership roles, they kind of then used that opportunity to kind of push for their own rights. One of the most important figures in the women's rights movement of the 60s is Betty Friedan, who published a book called The Feminine Mystique, which is kind of considered to be the Bible of feminism to certain degrees. And that kind of explained, and being a popular book kind of showed to most of society what issues women face. Things that weren't necessarily, I'm sure they were known by many people, but it took something like this to really kind of put them out in the open and for them to be more understood, right? And so things like this started to push the dialogue forward of, hey, women also need to have certain rights. There are certain things that impact women, and this crosses color barriers, right? Women of all colors are impacted by this. In the 60s, again, like I said, there was this kind of malleable time period, right? And so the movement started to gain momentum. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which sought to create equal employment opportunities for women in government jobs. So it was basically a committee which was supposed to kind of make sure that there was no discrimination going on. NOW was created, which was the National Organization for Women. Their big push was for childcare facilities and equality in hiring. Again, childcare, if you guys think back to looking at, Gilman and Florence Kelly and those women from back in the 1920s and the Progressive era, right? They were always pushing for childcare as a way for women to both enjoy the joys of motherhood, but also to have a chance to pursue their own career opportunities, right? In 1968, there was a famous Miss America protest in which they protested the Miss America pageant, saying that it was, dehumanizing to women and kind of saying that the only thing important about a woman is her beauty and not her intelligence or her skills. So that became a very widespread protest and kind of push for a different yardstick for women, that it's not all about how good of a mother or wife or how good looking you are, but rather it's who you are as a person, what you can achieve, right? And then also Gloria Steinem, seen here, was another very important feminist movement or leader of the 1960s. She created Miss Magazine, and this kind of led to also the usage of the term Miss, right? MS. Before it was Miss, M-I-S-S, if you were single, and M-R-S, Mrs., if you were married, right? So the idea was that, your identity changes based on whether you're married or single, right? Miss, MS, became just for all women, right? So it kind of took away this notion of you being married changes who you are or attaches you to something, right? Funny note though, this has been out of style for a while, but there actually used to be two different terms for men too. Mr. was for a married man, but master was for a single man, which that is definitely not used anymore. So like I said, the use of Miss became popular. We started to question notions of gender segregation, especially in schools, right? Many schools, especially colleges, didn't allow women, right, for a long time. But then in the 50s and 60s, many colleges started to open their doors to women, and we started to see more push for women in higher education. The Higher Education Act of 1972 guaranteed women more opportunity to higher education, to college acceptance and college education. It also increased the opportunities for women in college sports. So Title IX specifically says that you have to have an equal number of sports positions for men and women in college. So if you have a football team, which is going to be all male and 50 spots, let's just say, you have to have 50 spots of women's sports. And it can be 20 for volleyball, 20 for soccer, and 10 for basketball or whatever, right? But you have to have equal numbers, okay? The EOC, their power was expanded in the 1970s as well. The government started to allow tax breaks for daycare, which is important, right? So if you send your kids to daycare, you can write that off on your taxes. So before, if you wanted to use daycare, you have to kind of pay double. You still have to pay, and then you still have to pay taxes on top of that. So this kind of gave women more opportunities to use daycare. And then we have the famous Roe v. Wade, which guaranteed women the right to an abortion in 1973, which has unfortunately come under fire in recent years and become a topic of debate for some reason. But this was a kind of the culmination of the women's rights movement of the 60s and 70s. All right, so last thing for you guys to do for today. Now, again, we definitely didn't touch on all of the various groups that pushed for civil rights movements or civil rights during the 1960s and 70s. Again, we're kind of short on time. Had we had time in class, we would have looked at different groups, would have spent more time on these groups, and so I am sorry if I left anything out. It was not my intention to do so, but just kind of we're limited here. Please answer these 3 questions. And do so on your Google Doc, and then just complete the final kind of reflection question that I've posted on Google Classroom, and then we're done for the year. Thank you guys. I had an awesome time with you guys, and I hope to see you all next year. Take it easy, guys.